This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
I just want to say thanks to you, because I would never been able to retire if I hadn't got hooked onto you 10 years ago. And I really owe this to you that I've met my goal, to retire early and not work for the man and kind of be my own boss. And I would never been able to do that had I not. I guess I was a little discouraged 10 years ago, but hooking onto your podcast and learning from what you were teaching has made this all possible.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to episode 2222. Kind of an auspicious number today, huh? 2222. Anyway, thank you for joining me, Empowered Investors Nationwide. I am looking forward to having you join us today for our continuing conversation with Charles Duhigg. It's just great. He's the author of Super Communicators, the author of The Power of Habit. These are such seminal works, and his content is fantastic. So he'll be here with us in just a moment to talk about how we can be more successful in life and business and investing, of course. So that's going to be great. He'll be here in just a moment. I wanted to share with you a couple of quick charts. If you're watching on video, this is some good stuff you haven't seen before. This is from an upcoming interview that I just taped, and it will be coming up soon. But this guest shared some really interesting data and some really interesting charts. So first off, this is a build-to-rent company, Quinn Homes. And what they do is they have about 5,000 homes as a small institutional investor, and they build them to rent them. That's single purpose, right? Basically, they've done a comparison of monthly housing costs to show tenants that it's actually cheaper to rent their house than it is to go and buy the same house. And this isn't always true. Of course, it changes depending on prices at the time, rents at the time, and interest rates at the time. And of course, inflation and income. And hey, it's complicated, right? It's a complicated thing. But these charts are pretty telling. And so the first one shows that basically if you rent their home, and these are entry-level homes, the cost will be $2,085 per month. But if you buy the same home, not only do you have to put a down payment down, but the cost, according to them, and they have their way of doing their numbers, which you'll hear about on the upcoming episode, their cost estimate is $3,477. Of course, they've got PMI in there, private mortgage insurance, which is fairly expensive. And we as investors don't have to deal with that because we're always putting 20% down. And below 20% is when you have to pay for mortgage insurance to insure the lender against defaults. And that's kind of expensive. So that's the equation. But what is even more interesting is this historical cost of owning versus renting. And if you're listening on audio, I'm explaining this all to you. If you have a chance, catch me on a video platform like YouTube or Rumble and look at it there too. But the historical information is pretty interesting as well. I do disagree with one part of it, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But I'm looking at a chart that starts at the year 2000 and goes on up to May of this year. And so we've got basically a quarter century of data here. And at certain times, it's been more expensive to purchase than to rent. And that's most of the time. And I do agree with that, generally speaking. Now, of course, it depends on the market. It depends on the price of the home. It's complicated. Like my favorite Facebook relationship status. It's complicated, okay? But interestingly, coming out of the Great Recession, according to their data, that is when it was cheaper to purchase than it was to rent. And I reported on this. 10 years ago, I was, 10 to 14 years ago, I was reporting on this. And you can just go back and listen to those old episodes and hear what I said back then. That's the great thing about being able to hold me accountable because it's all just there, right? All the episodes are there. And, if you listen to the Flashback Friday episodes, you get to hear those once a week too. So you can take me to task on my data and my forecasting over the last 21 years. So where I disagree though, is his company, his data is showing that only 4 years were cheaper to purchase than to rent. And I don't think that's actually true. I think it was cheaper during the beginning of the COVID era. I think it was also a lot cheaper now. Their data shows that it was only 3% more expensive to purchase than rent, whereas in 2005, it was 48% more expensive to purchase than rent. And as of May of this year, it was 57% more expensive to purchase than rent. Now, always ask yourself, what am I not seeing? What am I not being told? I always say, you can't hear the dogs that don't bark. And you've also got to ask yourself life's most important question at all times. And that question, of course, is compared to what? So what are we not seeing here? Let's ask ourselves that question. Well, one of the things we're not seeing is we're not seeing the cost of a down payment, right? That has to be factored into the equation. We're also not seeing the value and the benefit of the investment of ownership, the appreciation, the tax benefits, et cetera, et cetera. Income property is a wonderful multidimensional asset, but so is owner-occupied ownership of property, a multidimensional asset, even though it has fewer dimensions than wonderful income property rented to somebody else. But it still has multiple dimensions. It's not just about buy low, sell high. It's about many things, right? Buy low, sell high, get tax benefits, get leverage, get inflation-induced debt destruction, my trademark term, get all of these great benefits, right? And we've talked about that. But what you don't see here is some of that, and that's not factored into the equation. So what is the answer? What is the right thing to do? What is the action step, you ask Jason? Jason, what should I do with this information? Here's what you should do. This is the ideal situation, and it depends where you are on your journey of wealth creation. But if you are somewhat far along and you can afford a nice home, the ideal situation from a financial only perspective, well, not just financial only, there's a convenience factor too, is to rent a high-end home for yourself and buy lots of low-end entry-level rental properties that you rent to other people. That's the best deal. It's pretty much always been the best deal. There have been a few times where you should have bought the house you live in. And what else are we not being told by this data that I just shared with you? Well, we're not being told what the price of the house is in the second chart, where we see this historical cost of owning versus renting. And they're saying only 4 years it's been cheaper to purchase than to rent. And I disagree. I think there's been a good 6 years in this quarter century that it's been cheaper to purchase than rent. They say 4. We'll agree to disagree on that. Not a big deal. Overall, mostly it's cheaper to rent. But again, that doesn't tell you everything because you don't get the investment benefit when you rent and you don't lock in your cost for 3 decades like you do with your mortgage. So there are definitely some benefits for that. They're just looking at it from the snapshot in time where you would make the decision to buy versus rent. They don't look at how that affected you 3 years from now, 5 years from now, which it's almost always better to own. But like I've said, you know me, I've moved around a bit. I'd like to move around a bit more. I really want to try living in some different cities. And I've enjoyed that, even though it's kind of a hassle, frankly. But, for many years, I wanted to leave Southern California. And I finally did. Everybody said I'd come back, and I didn't. And, you'll miss this place so much, Jason. You love Newport Beach. And I'm like, yeah, it's a great place, but I've had enough. And so I've really enjoyed living in some other places and, meeting lots of different friends and just being in a different environment. Some people crave that more than others. I guess I have a little bit of wanderlust in me still. And the convenience of being a renter, especially a renter of a high-end home, because the economic benefits are fantastic when you're renting a high-end home, but also the convenience of just being able to give 30 days notice and move and not have to deal with selling the property is pretty awesome. That's a pretty awesome convenience. Now, what if you have a big family? What if you have 19 kids? Okay. And, your community is your life, right? There are a lot of people like that. I get it. I understand that everything is not a financial or even a convenience decision. So, you may want to just put down roots and stay there a while. But just remember, as a renter, you can sign a long-term lease. In fact, this company likes to do 3-year leases, but they do what? They do escalations. 4% annual escalations are what they put into their leases when they do a 3-year lease. But they're happy to lease you for a longer term. The landlords almost never want you to move. They just want you to stay, and they put the escalation clauses right in the contract. All right. So I just thought I'd share that with you before we get to Charles Duhigg. Also, I want to let you know my travel schedule a bit, because if you would like to schedule a one-on-one mentoring or coaching session with me, you can do that. Just reach out to one of our investment counselors through jasonhartman.com. They'll get that all arranged for you. Where am I going? Where am I going to be? We can meet in person. Why didn't I think of this before as I was traveling around to offer this? Because, of course, we do these sessions on Zoom all the time. They're very reasonably priced, and I can really help you do a portfolio makeover. I can help you with whatever questions you have, just one-on-one. But you do have the opportunity to do it in person as well. So I am in Denver now. I'm off to Las Vegas today because we're hosting the Collective Inner Circle Mastermind there. And then I have a speaking engagement in Las Vegas next week. And then after that, I will be on my way to good old Orange County, California. So I'll be in Newport Beach. I'll probably head down to San Diego as well. And then I will be heading to Miami for another speaking engagement. And by the way, if you're interested in joining me in Miami at this conference, you can actually get a free ticket because I'm a speaker. So I've got a limited number of free tickets. Just look in the description for this video and there will be a link in there, or look in the show notes for the podcast and there's a link in there. This is the Global Citizenship Week. I'm the keynote speaker opening the event. And if you're interested in a plan B, a second passport, residency in a different country, offshore planning, asset protection, things like that, this may be of interest to you. It'll be in Miami at the end of the month, and I will be the keynote speaker. I've got some free tickets that I'm just going to give away to our audience here. So look in the show notes or the podcast description for a link and some information on that in Miami. But you can also arrange a one-on-one meeting with me in Miami. And then after that, I'm headed to Austin, Texas. I'll be at John Maxwell's mastermind session. John Maxwell, the author, he's fantastic. I got to share the stage with him speaking at another event a couple of weeks ago. And we are going to his mastermind event there, which will be nice. And then I'm also having a kind of a cool lunch with none other than Lance Armstrong. You know that name, Tour de France, Lance Armstrong in Austin, Texas as well. So I'll be there for a few days. And if you'd like to meet with me one-on-one in any of these places, just reach out to our investment counselors through jasonhartman.com, or if you're already in touch with one, and they'll be glad to arrange a one-on-one coaching session in person. Otherwise, we do those on Zoom regularly, so you can do that as well. All right, let's get to Charles Duhigg and talk about the power of habits and how to be a super communicator. And before we go, let's hear an interesting clip of the day.
Say goodbye to your American dream, because what was a slow and steady marathon for private equity to buy up all the family homes in America just hit absolute warp speed, and it is basically single-family housing Armageddon. And for all of you that think your politicians, either Republican or Democrat, are coming to save you, let me go on ahead and get ahead of you there. The politicians you think you trust the most have gone full-on Houdini or David Copperfield, holding bills out here like a red herring to keep you busy thinking they're coming to save you, while they're taking bribes back here, and I've got all the receipts. The politicians you trust the most are the ones taking those dollars. Let's get into it. Over the last 9 months, I have been screaming from the rooftops that the increase in private equity acquisitions of single-family homes would be the bankrupting of the entirety of the working class of America. Lots of politicians have been saying they were acquiring 15% of homes, or 16% of homes, 18% of homes. Some have even gone so far as to say 20% of homes in major markets. I've been saying at least 23%, but I thought it was higher. Unfortunately, when it comes to private equity, you can't see what they're doing. You can't see it because there's no regulatory agency that has insight into it, and there's no regulatory filing requirements for most private equity firms. However, there is ability to see tax documents, and the housing tax bills for last year are in, and we have got to say it is so much worse than any of us thought possible. That's right, folks. In the year of our Lord 2023, a full-on 44% of all single-family home purchases were by private equity firms. Do you understand how big a deal that is? Because for the last 9 months, everyone's been saying if they were buying about 20%, that would mean that by 2030, they were going to acquire 61% of all single family homes, 61% by 2030. This is double that, which means we've hit warp speed, and we're going to get to that number much, much, much sooner than any economists predicted, at least out in the open.
When people begin exercising, they tend to have a calendar, right? They check off each day that they've gone to the gym.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the check becomes a manifestation of a reward.
Well, and back to AA that we talked about earlier. Yeah. They count the days of being
That's
sober,
exactly
right?
Yeah,
that's
exactly right.
Like I remember I had a lady in my office years ago that was an alcoholic, and her license plate said, July 72. And I'm like, what is this on your license plate? And she says, well, that's the day I became sober. And that was many years ago, obviously.
So the key is to manufacture those celebrations for yourself, manufacture the rewards if the behavior itself is not delivering it. Yeah. Because your brain needs those rewards. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And also that became, in her example, kind of her identity, right? She saw it every day, her license plate. Yeah. Very interesting. Absolutely. Okay. Charles, anything else you want to say on habits? This is such a great topic.
No, I think we got to a lot of it.
Powerful on this. I just love it.
Thanks.
So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's the power of habit. If anyone wants to buy it, it's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do want to have a little more time on super communicators because communication is obviously such an important skill. Just give us kind of the thesis of the book, if you will.
Yeah. So super communicators began because I fell into this pattern with my wife that I didn't understand, which I think is pretty typical in relationships, which is I would come home from work sometimes and I'd start complaining about my day. And my wife would listen, my boss doesn't appreciate me. And my wife would give me this perfectly good advice. She'd say, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch? You guys can get to know each other. And I would, instead of listening to her advice, I would get even more upset. I would say, like, you're supposed to be supporting me. You're supposed to be on my side. Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? And she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And this happened again and again. It happened at work too, right? Like I would miscommunicate with my employees or my direct reports. And I didn't understand why. And so I went to researchers and I asked them what's going on. And they said, well, actually, we're living through this golden age of understanding communication. And one of the things that we've discovered is that we tend to think of a discussion as being about one thing, right? We're talking about my day or our kids' grades or where to go on vacation. But actually, they said every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're talking about making plans or solving problems together. But then there's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to listen and empathize.
This is a common thing that women say about men, how they don't like the different communication styles. Yeah. Like women just want you to hear them, right? They don't want you to solve the problem, but men want to solve the problem. Right?
Well, I think it's actually what's happening there. And let me there's this third bucket of conversations, which are social conversations about how we relate to each other. What's happening in that situation is that if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, it's very hard to hear each other and it's very hard to feel connected. In my case, I was having an emotional conversation. My wife was responding with a practical conversation.
Right.
So we were like ships passing in the night. And it turns out not to be gendered this way. It's basically kind of a myth that women have more emotional conversations than men do. But if it's the opposite, and, you come home and your wife is talking about her problems and you try and solve her problems and she doesn't like that, it's because she's having an emotional conversation. And instead of matching her, you're having a practical conversation.
So do all conversations have these three buckets going on at once?
Not at once, but they cycle through them, right? So we might start in an emotional conversation. And as long as we become aligned, it's called the matching principle in psychology. And the matching principle says good communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. If you bring up something that seems emotional and I lean into that and I kind of respond and I empathize, then what's going to happen is that as we move through this conversation, we're going to go from different conversation to different conversation. We might start emotional and then get practical and then go to social and then go back to practical and then emotional again. But as long as we're moving together, we're going to feel connected. And most importantly, we're going to be able to hear each other much, much better. And the reason why is because when we are communicating with each other, the reason we're communicating is because our brains start looking alike. Within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment. And it makes sense because if I tell you about something I'm feeling, if I tell you about emotion, you actually experience that emotion a little bit, right? Right. If I tell you about an idea, you actually experience that idea. So the fact that our brains would start to look similar is not that surprising.
Like in an fMRI, for example, you mean really look similar scientifically? Okay, got it.
Literally, they start to look similar. Your brain waves start to match each other.
That's when you're syncing up.
That's when you're achieving this entrainment. And if you think about it, talking about emotional topics versus practical topics uses different parts of your brain. So it would be very, very hard for me to have a practical conversation and you would have to have an emotional conversation and for our brains to look similar. So when we match each other, what we do is we begin allowing our brains to entrain to synchronize. And then we're able to actually hear each other much, much better.
Okay, so is the advice here, the action step, that when we're in a conversation, we should just be mindful of these three different phases of the conversation and try to stay in the same phase the other person?
Try to match the person or invite them to match you, right? So let's say you're sitting in a meeting room and you're waiting for the meeting to start, right? And you turn to the guy next to you and you say, hey, how was your weekend? And they say, oh, it was great. I went to my kid's graduation and it was just amazing. So the easiest thing to do would be to say, oh, congratulations. That's great. Okay, let's get down to business. Here's the agenda, right? But if you want to match that person, they just said something that's like a little bit emotional, not hugely emotional, but if you want to match that person, the easiest thing to do is to say, oh, that's amazing. What did it feel like watching your kid walk across that stage? Like, was it fantastic? Like,
wow,
were you proud?
Right. Yeah.
Now, at that moment, what I'm doing is I'm saying, I see that you've said something that's a little bit emotional. I'm going to go ahead and match you, right? I'm not going to cry on your shoulder or ask you to like tell me like some sob story, but I'm going to show you. And now we're aligned. And then I say, oh man, it's so great to hear that. Like, I actually think about my kids graduating and like kind of bittersweet because like, you know, I'm proud of them, but also they're going to be leaving home. Okay. Now, if you guys don't mind, let's go ahead and look at the agenda. Now we're moving together from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation. And we are all completely aligned. And we're going to be able to hear each other and connect much, much more easily.
Okay, got it. So the three buckets again, let's just rephrase those.
Is practical, right? Emotional and social. And social is about how we relate to each other and the identities that are important to us. Okay.
So you didn't give much example of the social in a conversation.
Well, let me demonstrate it with you. So you're a podcaster. Do you feel like that's an important identity? Like when you introduce yourself at a party, how do you introduce yourself like in terms of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's an important part of my identity because I like the reward of making impact, right? Sharing great ideas and making impact. And I like hearing from people that I've made an impact, you know?
Yeah. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that like having a positive influence on the world is something that's important to you.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that because I'm a journalist and it's the same thing. Like when I write stories or I write books, I want lots of people to read them because I want to know that my work meant something to them, that it has some effect. So that's a social conversation we just had, right? Because we're not talking about our emotions and we're not talking about practical matters. We're talking about how we see ourselves in terms of society, that you want to have an impact. That's how you see that identity is really important to you. And it's something that I can match. It's important to me in a different way, in a different venue, but I understand why it's important.
Yeah.
So the key is that with an emotional conversation, the goal is oftentimes to empathize, to show that person that you hear the emotion that they're speaking and that you recognize why it's either good or bad. It's something that's easy or hard for them. In a social conversation, empathy is less important. Validation is important. So I see that you see yourself as X. I'm going to validate that I recognize that. And if you think about identities that are even harder to talk about, right? Race, gender, political affiliation.
Yep.
Coming up to someone who says like, you know, I love Trump. I think he's great. If you validate that and say, look, what I hear you saying is that you care a lot about security and you feel like Trump is better on security than the other candidates. I totally understand that. I disagree with you. Like, I think that there's other reasons to vote for other people, but I understand why you support this guy.
Right. Yeah.
That validation,
that's a much more productive conversation than telling them they're an idiot.
Yeah. The alternative is being like, you're a moron and he's terrible.
How can you like Kamala? You know, she doesn't say anything. I mean,
Right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, communication, right? Look, this is a perennial episode, so we don't want to be too timely on election issues, but I see how you do it one-on-one, but how do you do it on one-on-many? And you reminded me when you said empathy, you reminded me of Bill Clinton's old saying, I feel your pain. You know, he used to say that.
Yeah, no, he's really good. He's really good, right? Like, so what's happening when Bill Clinton says, I feel your pain, or what's happening? I don't know if anyone listening has been to a Trump rally or to a Harris rally. But what you'll see is the candidates proving that they are listening to you and trying to match you. Trump in particular, at Trump rallies, if Trump says something and the audience applauds, they react to it, he'll lean into that. He'll say even more about the topic. That's why crazy things keep on getting said on the podiums, is because so much of it is unscripted because he's reacting to the audience. And so it doesn't really matter if it's one-on-one versus one-on-many. It's the same basic principles. And the principles are figure out what kind of conversation you're having, match the other person or invite them to match you, prove that you are listening to them. Listening is not enough. You have to prove that you're listening because they might not be aware that you're listening, even if you are. And then oftentimes asking a certain kind of question, which is known as a deep question, is very, very powerful. And a deep question is just something that invites me to talk about my values, like my beliefs or my experiences, which could be as simple as if you meet someone and they say they're a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? When you ask that question, that's a deep question. You're asking that person, you're inviting that person to say something meaningful. And as a result, they'll probably, and if you respond in kind, if you prove to them that you've been listening, they're going to feel close to you. It's actually hardwired into our brains.
Yeah, right. That's a very good point. But back to the one-to-many thing, that works if you're on stage, right? And you get the reaction of a live audience. Can you do it when you're on a podcast or on TV or radio?
Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, on a podcast, we're having a conversation, right? So there is that interplay. But oftentimes when you're writing something or when you're just speaking on a podcast, you're in dialogue with the audience and you're anticipating how the audience is hearing what you're saying and how they're reacting to it, right? And the difference between a really good writer and a junior writer is that
a writer, for example, you're staring at a blank page on a screen on a computer. You have no reaction.
But you do in your head, right? I type a sentence and I think to myself, how is the reader going to read this? Right? What questions is this going to bring up for the reader? Mm-hmm. Is this going to make them happy? Are they going to think it's funny? Are they not going to think it's funny? I'm constantly in dialogue with my readers as I'm writing. The fact that I can't hear them at that particular moment does not mean that I'm not aware of what I think they're going to say. And the difference between...
You have to presuppose it. Now, you may well have a track record. Like when you write your next book, right, you have a track record. So because you've heard a lot of feedback from your readers, right? You've been a journalist for a long time. But on your first try, if you don't have that feedback, you have to presuppose what it might be, right?
And that's usually why people, when they're first starting to write, are not as good writers as when they're better down the road, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, you do the same thing. I don't know. Are you married?
Single. Yeah.
Okay, you're single. But when you're in a relationship, you presuppose how your girlfriend is going to hear something you say, right? And then you kind of test it.
And I've gotten better at it over the years.
Yeah, exactly. And you've gotten better because you've tested whether you're right or wrong.
Right.
Writing's the same thing. You're basically presupposing, I think the audience is going to like this. I think they're going to think this is funny or interesting. And then it turns out they don't. And now I'm updating in Bayesian speak, I'm updating my priors.
Right.
But we do this presupposition every time we communicate. It's at the core of communication. And so the fact that now if I'm having a conversation with someone, I get to get feedback much, much faster than if I'm writing something. But it's the same basic process.
To be a good communicator, that really requires a lot of intelligence. Because, you have to kind of do this presupposition. You have to be very aware of feedback. If you are getting feedback, you have to use past feedback. It's a complex process, isn't it?
It's a complex process, but it's a process that our brain has evolved to be very good at. So if you think about it, Homo sapiens' superpower is communication.
Right.
Like communication
and consensus building, I'd say. Community is really a superpower of Homo sapiens too, right?
Well, right. But it's not possible.
Without
there's plenty of community. Yeah. Unless you can communicate, you can't consensus build. You can't build a community.
Right.
And so communication is the thing that has allowed our species to survive and succeed so well.
Yep.
And so as a result, our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of people who are not book smart and would not score high on IQ tests who are great communicators or super communicators because they've paid attention to it. That's the thing, is that one of the biggest findings of the research that's going on right now is that anyone can be a super communicator. Anyone can become someone who can connect with almost anyone. It's not about having some inborn skill, or it's not about being smarter than other people. Rather, it's about recognizing that communication is a set of skills. And when you practice those skills and you make them into habits, you tend to be able to connect with people and hear them and speak in a way that they're willing to listen to you much, much better.
So you've said them in our conversation, but do you want to just maybe give us a little checklist of some of these super communicator skills?
Yeah. So one of the biggest skills is to ask more questions, particularly deep questions that invite you to talk about your values and your beliefs and your experiences. And one way to think about that is, rather than asking someone about the facts of their life, ask them how they feel about their life, right? Rather than saying oh, you live on the West Side, saying, oh, do you like living on the West Side? What do you like about it? So that's ask more questions. The second one is prove that you're listening. There's this technique known as looping for understanding that the book explains pretty well, where it's 3 steps. You ask a question, and then you repeat back what you heard the person say in your own words, and then you ask if you got it right. And for conflict and formal situations, that really helps a lot. But it could be just as simple as like asking a follow-up question or saying, oh, it's interesting that like you liked that movie. Here's another movie I liked, showing that you're paying attention, showing that you're in the conversation.
Right.
And then the third thing is paying attention to what kind of conversation is happening and trying to match the person or invite them to match you. So if somebody says, oh, I went to my kid's graduation, it was amazing, hearing that there's like a little emotional opportunity in there. And then you can match them just by saying, what did that feel like to watch your kid walking across the stage? If you do those 3 things, basically your ability to communicate is going to exponentially increase. And people are going to feel very connected to you, because this is the other part of how our brains have evolved. We are hardwired that when someone does those behaviors, to trust them more, to like them more, to think that they're more intelligent, because we feel more connected to them.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. That's really interesting. You talk about the power of storytelling, and I have a feeling the power of storytelling touches on a lot of these points you've already made, but did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I think the reason why stories are so powerful is because they give us a way to signal what kind of conversation we hope to have. So if you think about like when I tell you an anecdote, oftentimes what I'm doing is I'm telling you, this guy went to this place and this thing happened and he got his heart broken. And then he went and he started working out, and he discovered that like if he was taking creatine powder, it really helped him work out. And then he ended up finding a new girlfriend that was even better than his old girlfriend. Right. So what I just did is I was describing like sort of an emotional situation, and then a practical situation, and then an emotional situation again. And a story allows me to signal and announce pretty easily what kind of conversation we're having. And so you can follow along really, really well. It's also just more interesting, right? Like, surprise and interest are something that catch our attention and make it easier for us to pay attention and to listen.
Yeah, really good, Charles. Fantastic information. I don't want to keep you too long. I'd love to talk to you for another hour, but just wrap this up with anything I haven't asked you, anything you just want to share with the audience. And of course, the books are available in all the usual places with fantastic reviews, by the way, and many reviews. So congratulations on your success, and looking forward to seeing more of your work in the future. But anything I haven't asked you or we didn't talk about that you want to touch on?
No, I would say the thing that sort of the thread that connects all of my books, Power of Habit and Super Communicators, is that there is science that can tell us how to make more choices that we want to make, right? Any habit can be changed. Every single habit in your life is within your control. Anyone can become a super communicator. Anyone can learn the basic skills of communication that make us better at speaking so that other people want to listen, and listening so that we really understand what they're trying to tell us. There is a science that explains to us how to learn those skills and how to use them. Now, that doesn't mean that just giving you like a little aphorism is going to do the trick. Sometimes you have to read a book, because the book will get into the nitty-gritty of it, into the details. This is how habits work. This is how communication works. But there is a science out there, and it is within everyone's power to become the person they want to be. You just have to learn what the techniques are and the skills that make it possible.
It's great stuff, Charles. Do you have a website you want to give out?
I do, yeah. So if you just Google, I'm charlesduhigg.com. And, if you Google the Power of Habit or Super Communicators, it'll come up. It's being sold at Amazon and Barnes and Nobles and your local independent bookstore and Audible. There's audiobooks of both of them. And yeah, so I'd love to hear from people.
Excellent. Good stuff. Charles Duhigg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.